So here's a strange twist of fate for you. The man who bankrolled Christian Dior in 1946 wasn't broke at all. He was, at that exact moment, quite possibly the richest man in France, a cotton and textile magnate so dominant people called him the King of Cotton. And yet, by the time he dies in 1980, his entire industrial empire has collapsed into bankruptcy, gets carved up by creditors, and gets scavenged by a 35-year-old real estate developer nobody in fashion had ever heard of, a guy named Bernard Arnault, who eventually turns the leftover scraps into the largest luxury conglomerate on earth. You'd expect this story to be about glamorous designers and Parisian ateliers. It's actually about textile mills, horse racing debts, a government bailout that never came, and one of the most audacious corporate takeovers in French business history. So buckle in, because today we're getting into the bizarre story of how Marcel Boussac built Christian Dior, lost everything he owned, and unknowingly handed the keys to the man who'd go on to build LVMH. Let's go back to 1946, Paris. France is barely a year out of Nazi occupation, and the fashion industry is basically flat on its back. Fabric is still rationed, ateliers are gutted, and the elegant spendthrift Paris that used to set the world's style is now scraping by. Marcel Boussac, though, isn't scraping by at all. He'd built a textile empire so vast during and after the war that he controlled an estimated 90% of French cotton production at one point, plus newspapers, a horse racing stable, and factories running around the clock. His problem isn't money, it's inventory. He's sitting on mountains of fabric with nowhere fashionable to send it. And post-war French couture desperately needs a jolt of confidence to convince the world Paris still matters. That's the vulnerability driving this whole story. Not poverty, but a textile giant with too much cloth and not enough glamour to sell it through. So Boussac makes an unusual bet. He'd actually wanted to install a designer named Christian Dior at an existing, struggling fashion house he already owned. But Dior, quietly confident, previously a moderately successful sketch artist and assistant designer, turns him down and asks for something nobody had really done before. His own house, entirely under his own name, fully financed by Boussac's textile fortune. And this is the real invention here, more than any single dress. Up until this point, couture houses were mostly personal fiefdoms, funded by the designer's own reputation and slow-grown client relationships. Boussac essentially treats fashion like industrial manufacturing. He pours in serious capital upfront, guarantees Dior total creative control, and structures the whole thing to move fabric at scale rather than one-off gowns for a handful of aristocrats. It's the old world of couture as craft colliding head-on with the new world of couture as industry. And in February 1947, Dior's very first collection, nicknamed the New Look, with its cinched waists and yards of skirt fabric, detonates across the fashion press and essentially resets what post-war femininity is supposed to look like. Now, running parallel to Dior in this story is Boussac himself. And here's the thing, despite being the money behind it all, he never really gets remembered as a fashion figure. He's the financier, the industrialist, a man obsessed with horse breeding, who happened to also bankroll one of fashion's most iconic names. And history quietly writes him out of the glamorous version of the story, the same way silent investors always get written out. A year after the New Look debuts, Boussac pushes Dior into launching a perfume line too, because he understands something crucial. Dresses are custom, slow, and expensive to produce, but a bottle of scent can be manufactured cheaply and sold globally, over and over again, to people who could never afford the couture itself. And hey, quick interruption. If you're new here, this is exactly the kind of hidden financial engineering behind glamorous brands that this channel digs into every week, so go ahead and hit subscribe. I'm trying to push us toward our next milestone. Okay, back to Boussac and his cotton empire. Let's actually put some numbers on how big this got. At its post-war peak, the Boussac Group employed roughly 24,000 people across textile mills, newspapers, and racing operations. Christian Dior perfumes alone were bringing in more revenue within a few years than the entire couture side of the house, the same razor and blade dynamic that saved Chanel decades earlier. By the late 1970s, when everything eventually falls apart, the debts piled up inside the Boussac Group reportedly reached into the billions of francs. And when Bernard Arnault finally takes control in 1985, the concordat approved by creditors covers something like 2.7 billion francs in outstanding debt. Compare that to the fact that Arnault initially puts in a shockingly small amount of his own money, somewhere around $15 to $40 million, depending on how you count it, to gain control of an empire that within a few years is valued on the stock market at 8 billion francs. So, mechanically, how did this actually work? Boussac's whole model was vertical integration. He owned the raw cotton production, the mills that wove it, and now, through Dior, a couture and perfume brand that could sell the finished product at massive markup under a prestigious French name. It's basically the influencer marketing playbook of the 1940s. Instead of paying a celebrity to wear your product, you install a genius designer as the face and let his name do the selling, while your factories quietly do the actual manufacturing behind the curtain. Dior's licensing arrangements would eventually extend the name to stockings, ties, and cosmetics, all manufactured under contract and stamped with a signature Boussac himself never personally designed a single stitch of. This model spreads fast. Other couture houses watch Dior's perfume revenue dwarf its dress sales and start licensing their own names the same way. It becomes the standard playbook across French fashion for the next half-century, eventually feeding directly into how conglomerates like LVMH and Estée Lauder structure their entire licensing businesses today. Dior itself expands into New York, then across the globe, becoming genuinely the dominant French fashion export of the 1950s, exactly the kind of soft power boost post-war France desperately needed. But here's where the internal rot creeps in. Boussac, stubborn well into his 80s, refuses to modernize his textile factories as cheaper competition rises in the 1960s and 70s, and he refuses to scale back production even as sales stagnate. He keeps borrowing from banks to plug the gap instead of restructuring, and when he asks the French government in 1978 for help, forgiving debt, blocking foreign competition, letting him redevelop some of his land, Paris says no. 21 companies inside the Boussac group get pushed into court-ordered receivership within weeks. It's a stunningly fast collapse for an empire that size, and Boussac, humiliated, effectively loses control of everything, including the crown jewel, Christian Dior, which by pure irony is now the healthiest, most profitable piece of the whole wreckage. The group first gets picked up by rival industrialists, the Willett brothers, who can't stabilize it either. And finally, in 1984, a young and largely unknown real estate developer named Bernard Arnault convinces the French state to let him take over the entire Boussac Saint-Frère conglomerate, famously paying a purely symbolic 1 franc for it, while committing tens of millions of dollars and promising to preserve thousands of jobs. Arnault doesn't actually want the textile mills at all. He wants exactly one thing buried inside that portfolio: Christian Dior. Within a couple of years, he's dismantled most of the rest of the group, kept Dior and a department store called Le Bon Marché, and used that foothold to maneuver his way, only a few years later, into control of Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy itself. Today, Christian Dior sits at the absolute center of LVMH, the conglomerate Arnault built almost entirely on the back of what he salvaged from Boussac's collapse. Dior alone is estimated to generate several $1 billion a year for the group, and Arnault's family remains one of the wealthiest on the planet, with a fortune that's touched well past $100 billion at various points. The Dior name that Marcel Boussac financed as an industrial bet on cotton and confidence in 1946 is now arguably the single most valuable asset to ever emerge from a French bankruptcy court. Now look, this video's focused a lot on the financial chess game here, but it's worth being honest about a few uncomfortable threads underneath it. The new look itself required an enormous amount of fabric at a time when ordinary French citizens were still living under rationing, and it drew real criticism at the time for celebrating extravagance while much of the country was still recovering. Christian Dior's own name and creative legacy have, over the decades, often been overshadowed in the popular imagination by the financiers who owned the house after him. First Boussac, then Arnault, a pattern where the actual designer's story gets flattened into a footnote inside a much bigger business narrative. And the entire Boussac takeover saga itself, including the French government handing public subsidies to Arnault's buyout, sparked genuine controversy at the time over whether a private financier should have been allowed to walk away with the most valuable piece of a public bailout, while thousands of textile jobs elsewhere in the group quietly disappeared within months. Maybe that's the real thread running through this whole story. Behind almost every legendary fashion house, there's a moment where someone with money, not someone with a sketch pad, decided what would survive and what wouldn't. So here's the question worth sitting with. When an empire like Dior gets passed from a fallen cotton baron to an ambitious young financier, almost like a spoil of war, are we really celebrating the designer's vision, or just the winner of a decades-long game of financial musical chairs? If that landed for you, drop a comment, because I want to know how many of you had no idea Dior's whole existence traces back to a bankrupt cotton king. And if you liked this one, go check out the episode on the Wertheimer family's quiet century-long grip on Chanel. It's basically the mirror image of this story. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you in the next one.